By the late 19th century, America was still a young nation, wealthy beyond imagination yet uncertain of its own identity. The railroads had stitched the continent together, fortunes were rising faster than institutions could restrain them, and a new elite emerged, powerful not by lineage, but by capital. This was the Gilded Age, an era of glittering surfaces and hidden fractures, where wealth was celebrated openly and inequality was quietly ignored. It was within this world that Biltmore Estate was conceived, not as a home, but as a statement. A declaration that American money could rival European nobility, not only in scale, but in permanence. George Washington Vanderbilt, too, was not the most aggressive or flamboyant member of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Unlike his relatives, who pursued railroads, steel, and financial domination, George was drawn inward. He collected books, studied art, traveled obsessively through Europe, and immersed himself in history. He believed wealth without culture was hollow, and more importantly, he believed culture could be built. In 1888, Vanderbilt arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. What he found there was isolation, mist-covered valleys, and a landscape untouched by industrial noise. To him, this was not wilderness. It was opportunity, a blank canvas upon which an American aristocracy could be carved from stone. He commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt understood how power had always expressed itself in Europe, through scale, symmetry, and architectural dominance. Biltmore would not blend into its surroundings. It would command them. Construction began in 1889 and continued for 6 relentless years. Thousands of workers labored across the mountains. Stonecutters, craftsmen, engineers, and artisans assembled a structure unlike anything America had ever seen. 250 rooms, miles of corridors, libraries, banquet halls, indoor plumbing, electricity, elevators, and modern heating systems decades ahead of their time. Yet the true ambition of Biltmore was not its size. It was its illusion. Every wall, every arch, every detail was designed to suggest age, tradition, and inevitability, as if the estate had always belonged there, as if it were the natural center of the land itself. Inside, Biltmore was a world unto itself. A library holding over 20,000 volumes. Music rooms designed for elite gatherings. Corridors wide enough for ceremonial movement. It was not built for daily life. It was built for legacy. But from the moment its foundations were laid, Biltmore carried a contradiction at its core. It was created to symbolize permanence, yet it demanded a level of wealth so extreme that sustaining it would require constant sacrifice. It was a monument to stability, built atop financial vulnerability. On Christmas Eve 1895, the estate was officially unveiled. Lights illuminated the valley. Guests arrived to witness what many believed was the pinnacle of American success. Few understood that, even in that moment of triumph, time had already begun to turn against the dream. Biltmore was never just a mansion. It was a question, a challenge to history itself. And history, as it always does, was already preparing its answer. When the celebrations faded and the guests returned home, Biltmore was left with a reality few had considered. Grandeur, once built, does not rest. It consumes. Every corridor demanded heat. Every room required staff. Every stone carried a cost that did not disappear when admiration ended. George Vanderbilt understood this sooner than most. He knew Biltmore could not survive as a passive symbol of wealth. If the estate was to endure, it would need to function as something far more ambitious than a private residence. It would need to sustain itself. What emerged was a vision almost as radical as the mansion itself. Biltmore would become a fully integrated estate, an economic ecosystem designed to support its own excess. Agriculture, forestry, livestock, and industry would all operate under a single purpose, keeping the illusion alive. To accomplish this, Vanderbilt turned to Frederick Law Olmsted, the most influential landscape architect in America. Olmsted had shaped Central Park and redefined how cities understood nature. But at Biltmore, his task was unprecedented. He was not asked to design beauty alone. He was asked to restore a damaged landscape and make it productive. The land surrounding Biltmore had been stripped by logging and poor farming practices long before Vanderbilt arrived. Olmsted proposed something radical for its time. Scientific forestry, controlled harvesting, replanting on a scale never attempted in the American South. Millions of trees were planted, transforming exploitation into long-term management. Farms followed. A dairy operation built to modern standards supplied the estate and generated income. Poultry, vegetables, and livestock reduced dependence on outside markets. Roads, barns, and processing facilities turned Biltmore into a working organism, not just a decorative shell. On paper, the model was visionary. In practice, it revealed a deeper paradox. Every improvement increased complexity. Every system required oversight, every solution generated new costs. The more Biltmore tried to control its future, the heavier its present became. Inside the mansion, hundreds of employees worked unseen. Servants, engineers, cooks, librarians, groundskeepers, and technicians maintained a standard of perfection that could not fail. Silence itself had to be managed. Comfort had to be engineered. Nothing was allowed to feel accidental. George Vanderbilt retreated increasingly into his library. Surrounded by books chronicling the rise and collapse of European dynasties, he immersed himself in histories of families who once believed their wealth had no expiration date. In those pages, permanence often proved to be an illusion. Beyond the estate, America was changing. Industrial optimism was giving way to uncertainty. Financial panics, labor unrest, and political reform movements began to question the legitimacy of extreme wealth. The public mood shifted. What had once inspired admiration now attracted scrutiny. Biltmore stood untouched by these debates, yet deeply vulnerable to them. Its scale made it magnificent. Its scale also made it fragile. It was too large to ignore, too expensive to simplify, and too symbolic to escape attention. By the early 20th century, the estate still appeared invincible, but beneath the surface, strain had become routine. Biltmore no longer represented a future being built. It represented a future that demanded constant defense. And then, quietly without warning or ceremony, the architect of that future disappeared. In March of 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died at the age of 51. There was no spectacle, no collapse, no public drama. But with his death, the structure holding Biltmore together quietly vanished. The estate had been designed around one vision, one temperament, one individual. And without him, its balance began to shift. Vanderbilt left behind a world too large for any single person to inherit easily. His only child, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, was just 13 years old. Overnight, she became the center of a legacy defined not by opportunity, but by obligation. Biltmore was not merely property. It was a responsibility measured in thousands of acres, hundreds of employees, and expenses that never paused. Edith Vanderbilt, George's widow, assumed control during one of the most unstable periods in modern history. Europe was descending into war. America's economy was tightening. Public sentiment toward extreme wealth was cooling, and the systems George had built, elegant as they were, offered little flexibility. Taxes rose, labor costs increased, agricultural revenues fluctuated. The estate continued to operate, but its margins narrowed year after year. What had once been an experiment in sustainability now struggled to sustain itself. Cornelia grew up within Biltmore's vast halls, but the experience was far from idyllic. The mansion was not designed for childhood. Its scale demanded distance, discipline, and formality. By the time she reached adulthood, she did not inherit a dream. She inherited a burden shaped by history and expectation. Her marriage to John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat, introduced new tensions. The couple divided their time between Europe and America, while Biltmore remained anchored in North Carolina, consuming resources regardless of their presence. Decisions became strategic rather than personal. The estate's survival required pragmatism, not sentiment. As the 1920s unfolded, American society changed rapidly. The glamour of the Gilded Age gave way to skepticism. The public began questioning the morality of inherited wealth. Grand estates no longer symbolized success. They symbolized excess. Then came 1929. The Great Depression did not destroy Biltmore overnight. It did something more devastating. It removed every illusion of inevitability. Asset values collapsed. Agricultural income stalled. Maintaining the estate became an exercise in endurance rather than ambition. Faced with shrinking options, the Vanderbilt family made a decision that would permanently alter the meaning of Biltmore. In 1930, the estate opened its gates to the public. Visitors were invited not as guests but as customers. Admission tickets replaced private invitations. Preservation replaced privacy. It was not simply a financial strategy. It was a psychological surrender. Biltmore ceased to exist as a private symbol of power and began its transformation into a shared artifact of history. The walls remained the same. The purpose did not. And once the estate crossed that threshold, there would be no return to what it had been. Opening Biltmore to the public was not an act of generosity. It was an act of necessity. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had stripped away the protections that wealth once provided. Even the most powerful families in America were forced to confront limits they had never imagined. The first visitors arrived not to admire architecture alone, but to witness a world that had once been inaccessible. They walked through halls built for private authority, now repurposed for public curiosity. Biltmore became a place of contradiction. Awe and resentment existed side by side. To remain operational, the estate underwent subtle but irreversible changes. Private rooms were reorganized for guided tours. Paths were designed not for ceremony, but for flow control. History was curated, simplified, and timed to fit the expectations of strangers passing through. Every adaptation carried a cost beyond finances. Authenticity became a fragile concept. How much could be altered before the estate ceased to be itself? Where did preservation end and performance begin? American culture was shifting. The Gilded Age, once admired for its ambition, was now examined for its excess. Estates like Biltmore were no longer seen as triumphs of progress, but as artifacts of imbalance. The mansion did not change, but its meaning did. The Vanderbilt family slowly withdrew from daily life at the estate. Management replaced intimacy. Decisions were evaluated through budgets and projections rather than tradition. Biltmore became an institution, not a home. Yet in this transformation, something unexpected occurred. By opening its gates, Biltmore entered public memory. It became a shared space, no longer defined solely by ownership, but by experience. What had once symbolized exclusion now became accessible, if only partially. Survival required compromise. And compromise reshaped identity. Biltmore endured the Depression not by resisting change, but by surrendering to it. The estate lived on, not as a relic frozen in time, but as a living structure forced to negotiate with history. The question was no longer whether Biltmore could be preserved. It was whether preservation itself would alter the very meaning of what was being saved. Surviving the Great Depression did not mean Biltmore was safe. It meant only that it had earned the right to continue negotiating with time. As the 20th century advanced, the estate faced a new reality. History alone could no longer justify its existence. It had to function. In the decades following World War II, American society moved faster than Biltmore ever could. Suburban expansion, mass tourism, and changing cultural values reshaped how people related to the past. Grand estates were no longer symbols of aspiration. They were questions waiting to be answered. The Vanderbilt descendants understood that preservation without adaptation was another form of decline. Biltmore could not remain a static monument. It had to become an operation, a carefully managed balance between heritage and commerce. Professional management replaced familial oversight. Long-term planning replaced tradition. The estate was reorganized into a complex system combining historical conservation, tourism, agriculture, and hospitality. Each element existed to support the others. Nothing could survive in isolation. The gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted were restored with archival precision, not as decoration, but as narrative. They told a story about land, control, and vision. Guided tours evolved from spectacle into interpretation, emphasizing labor, systems, and consequence alongside beauty. At the same time, Biltmore reintroduced economic activity once central to its identity. Vineyards returned to the land. A modern winery emerged, echoing George Vanderbilt's original experiments with self-sufficiency, but now aligned with market demand. Hotels and seasonal events followed, transforming the estate into a year-round destination. Luxury remained, but it was no longer private. It was curated, packaged, and shared. This transformation raised uncomfortable questions. When a historic site becomes a business, what is being protected, and what is being reshaped? Does accessibility democratize history or dilute it? Can authenticity survive constant exposure? Biltmore did not resolve these questions. It lived within them. Each decision reflected a compromise between financial survival and historical responsibility. Every visitor contributed to preservation and to change. Over time, the estate's identity shifted again. For many Americans, Biltmore was no longer associated with the Vanderbilt name at all. It existed as an independent symbol, detached from its creators, sustained by public engagement rather than inherited power. In this form, Biltmore found a kind of stability. Not permanence, but resilience. It no longer claimed eternity, it adapted to relevance. And in doing so, it prepared itself for its final role. Not as a monument to wealth, but as a mirror held up to it. Today, Biltmore Estate stands as one of the most recognizable architectural symbols in American history. Its limestone facade still rises above the Blue Ridge Mountains, unchanged in form, yet profoundly altered in meaning. What once declared private power now exists as public memory. Biltmore did not survive because it was too grand to fall. It survived because it learned to relinquish control. In doing so, it escaped the fate of countless Gilded Age estates that vanished when their owners could no longer justify their existence. George Washington Vanderbilt II believed culture could grant wealth a kind of permanence. He believed architecture could anchor power in time. In that belief, he was not foolish. He was human. He sought what all empires seek: continuity beyond the lifespan of those who build them. But history does not preserve intention. It preserves consequence. The Vanderbilt dynasty, once synonymous with American dominance, fragmented with each generation. Fortunes dispersed. Influence faded. What remained was not control, but evidence. Biltmore became that evidence, a physical record of ambition meeting reality. For some, the estate represents achievement on an unprecedented scale. For others, it embodies inequality, excess, and the cost of concentrating power. Both interpretations coexist within its walls. Neither can be erased. As visitors move through its corridors today, they are not walking through a preserved dream. They are walking through a negotiation between past and present. Every restoration choice, every guided narrative, reflects decisions made long after the original vision ended. In the end, Biltmore teaches a lesson that no fortune can avoid. Wealth may shape history, but it cannot command it. Stone may endure longer than people, but not longer than meaning. Time remains the final inheritor, and Biltmore, once built to defy it, now exists to remind us of its rule.